How many years into your marriage would you say you reached the jerk point?
10 to
10 years
15,
10 to 15
10,
years
12, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Allison, as he's pulling away from the church and pulling away from you, and as he's keeping things to himself, focusing more on himself, career, how are you feeling, and what's it like for you in the marriage as you're seeing him pull away and maybe aren't super happy? How are you feeling?
I was just really lonely. I was really lonely. And I felt like I was giving everything I had, and I didn't understand why we couldn't connect. And so I was just very confused, and I didn't know what to do because I felt like I was doing everything that I could, and I didn't know how to get to him. I couldn't even figure out, I didn't even know if I could really hurt him. Like, I felt like he was so closed off. I didn't know. I didn't know what to do. And it just kind of, escalated over time. And he pulled himself away, and there was just a lot of things that occurred that just continued to feed that pain and hurt.
Andrew, what do you want to say about kind of your darkest time where you were most disconnected and most selfish? What would you want to say about that? Kind of how you got there and what was going on?
I was living unconsciously. I was a zombie. I was a walking corpse. Working hard at life, giving everything I could to my career, even to my family. But I was missing something very fundamental, and that was a soul. I didn't know myself. I had nothing to give her. I couldn't offer her anything because I was so torn up inside. And that took me a long time to figure out, but that's exactly what was going on. And I was consciously aware of the things that I needed to do to have a happy life and a fulfilling marriage. It's what I wanted. But without resolving these inner issues, without being true to myself, I just had nothing to offer Allison or my kids. And I would be there. I would come home from work. I would be with the family. I wasn't making terrible life decisions. I was acting out in certain unhealthy ways at a subconscious level through negative thoughts and other things, but I wasn't making the big mistakes that you sometimes see, right? That everyone can point to and go, see, his life is jacked. I wasn't doing that. It was an inner turmoil, an inner alignment that was so off that it just prevented me from being the healthy, happy person that had the emotional capacity and spiritual capacity to be there for my wife, even though I loved her and I would profess my love to her. I didn't have the tools, the knowledge, the experience to open myself up to her and to our family and to our relationship. And so it was very much a lonely path. And looking back, I see my dad walking that same path in that same stage of his life. And I realize, how much of who we are comes from our upbringing and our parents. And not being conscious of that stuff and not resolving it can lead to so much heartache and strife, and how important it is to really dig that stuff out and remove it from from who we are. And I look back and I see my dad. I see myself going down a very similar path that he went through in that stage of his life, and it's really it's sorrowful now. It's really hard to think about, to be honest, but it's part of my path. It's part of our history, And it's helped me today to have the perspective to kind of see and feel what I was going through.
What were the ways that you would kind of self-medicate or distract, if you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, for sure. I'm crying in front of tens of thousands of people, so I'm open. Work would be number one. I threw myself into my career. I felt like that was my biggest value as a husband and a father, was to provide for my family. Plus, I felt like at work, I received accolades. I received compliments. I received raises. I was promoted very quickly in my career. And I really fed on that because I knew deep inside that I wasn't like an award-winning dad or husband. But at work, I was acknowledged as being somebody who went above and beyond. Beyond that, I think anger is a type of coping too. I felt myself, I would wake up in the mornings and my jaws would be sore from gritting my teeth at night. I would have negative inner dialogue driving down the street, rehashing uncomfortable situations with people and saying, I would have said this, or, and just that really unhealthy negativity that can come up, that fed me as well. Thankfully, I didn't develop any like serious addictions or anything, but, I watched porn on occasion, and that was hard for me because we'd still go to church in this time, and the anti-pornography voice grew pretty loudly. It's still there in Mormonism, and that created a lot of guilt. I'm like, am I really some kind of deviant for indulging in this on occasion? I have a much different perspective now, but that was part of that. That kind of fed into that unhealthy mindset at the time as well. But mostly it was kind of work and anger and just shutting down my emotions, man. Just keeping them so stuffed in there that it was just a geyser ready to explode, really.
And you talk about, we talked before a bit about sort of a moment where the bishop gets involved, and you're kind of talking a little bit about maybe some minor forms of discipline. Can you talk anything about that?
Yeah, sure. So in 2005, I made some decisions that led to some erosion of trust between Allison and I. Mostly of kind of a subconscious wasn't some affair or some like planned out thing. It was just bad judgment coming from a place of hurt. And it was to the level where I felt at the time I needed we talked about it. I was on a business trip, came home, told Allison all about it, and she was devastated. We went and talked to our bishop and, the whole disciplinary thing. I wasn't excommunicated or anything, but it was disciplinary, and part of the path we both felt would be important for me to kind of share this with our parents, and so I ended up doing that, and it turned into this another tribal shaming in my life. I had experienced that as a teenager, and it happened again as an adult, and it was very humiliating and misguided, thinking that I had I had done something so wrong that I had to seek the forgiveness of my priesthood leaders and of God, and that whole concept I see now as being so misguided and wrong. But that's what we both felt at the time, and we needed to heal. We both agreed on that. We both agreed there was something kind of fundamental that we needed to resolve. So yeah, I went through that, and in the middle of it, we moved, and I had to confess again to another bishopric, and it was, being able to, sitting there with my family at church, not being able to take the sacrament, and having my kids look at me like, Daddy, aren't you going to eat the bread? And I'm like, no, I had some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches before our church, so I'm, say, what do you tell a child, right? No, daddy's not worthy in the eyes of those guys sitting up there, and most importantly of God. So it felt at the time it was the right thing to do, but looking back, it probably actually made the situation worse.
Allison, how was the betrayal experienced by you? What was that like, and in the mindset of having grown so distant from him anyway, what was it like at the time to experience what you felt was a betrayal?
It was devastating. It was extremely, extremely hard. I had felt him pulling away for so long, and we were going in opposite directions. And as I clung more to the church, he went more the other way, and all the fears that the church would talk about in terms of, I couldn't trust Andrew. I didn't trust him at all. And I was really hurt and devastated and lonely and angry and broken. And it was horrible. It was a very deep, dark time.
What does it do as a Mormon mother who's chosen to stay home and take care of the kids? You don't have a job, a career, a way to make income. You're 100% reliant on your spouse to be earning the income. It's really hard to stay home and to raise kids. And then you feel a sense of betrayal where you don't even know you can trust that person that you're literally dependent on in almost every way.
Here's
what does
the
that
deal.
do?
I felt very trapped, and my initial reaction was, I'm going to probably have to divorce or leave. That's what you do when this happens, right? That's what I thought. And that was my initial reaction, if I'm honest. But I didn't know what I was going to do because I had a college degree, but I had 3 young kids and I was pregnant with my 4th. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But the bottom line is at this time period, I once again would get back on my knees and pray about it and really try to figure out what I was supposed to do. And every time I did that, no matter how bad it got, and even though I didn't trust him and I didn't understand why I was in this spot because I felt like I had done everything I could possibly do, I didn't know why this was happening to me or what was going on. I always felt like I should stay. And I wasn't supposed to leave. And I told him that. I said, you know what, I'm strong enough to leave. I'm not staying here because I'm weak. I have no problem walking out that door. And I meant it. I would have left and I would have been fine. I had found that inner strength in myself because I had been lonely for so long that I think I realized I didn't need him anymore. That's how I legitimately felt, is that I didn't need him. And I would be fine to leave. But I didn't feel like I should. And so I stayed.
Andrew, how does that feel to have your wife reach the point where she's like, I don't need him, but I'll stay for the commitment and the kids? How was that for you?
Oh man, it was, I don't need you. Probably one of the worst things I could have felt or heard at that time, right? I had created this idea of what my role, what my job was as a dad, as a husband, and I felt like I was doing my best to meet those, to fulfill all those things, those check boxes. With the exception of very few minor things, I did check all the boxes, right? And so to feel like, I didn't get caught. I wasn't having an affair. It wasn't like that. I did some things that I felt guilty about, and I told Allison because I wanted to heal as a couple, purely voluntarily. And so to then, a few weeks later hear, I don't need you, it was a wake-up call. It was like, there's something fundamentally wrong here. Even though we get along on a day-to-day, even though we have beautiful children, we have great vacations, our family album is awesome. But there's something fundamentally off. And that was one of the first times in my life where I really felt powerless. I felt helpless. I felt, what do I really have to offer her? And why are we why are we even together? If she doesn't need me, why am I here? Am I just a paycheck provider? Am I a roommate? Am I an errand runner? And it really caused me to start digging deep. And that moment was the moment that I started to really look in the mirror and take a really hard look.
In one of my previous interviews, I sort of did these timeouts where I give a coaching moment, and I'm going to do one of those here. As Margie and I have worked with lots of couples over the past few years, we've sort of developed this model around emotional intimacy that so many couples sort of begin a marriage by bringing the sense of brokenness into the marriage, where they had dysfunctional families or trauma in some sort of way. So they bring that to the marriage, unhealthy communication sort of patterns and role models, fears and anxieties, and even past traumas. They bring that to the marriage. They both sign up to the Mormon sort of paradigm, which is we're going to obey and do what we're told and have kids and earn a living and be a housewife and serve in our callings. And so the church can provide this infrastructure where two people can live and a marriage can persist and children can happen, and maybe many of the basics of a family your basic needs of a family can be met. But what isn't really growing in the dyad is a strong sense of emotional intimacy, because emotional intimacy is fueled by vulnerability, by a shared sense of values, by a willingness to communicate our deepest needs, by a sense of unconditional love, and fierce commitment to the other. And those things are hard, because how do you have unconditional love if you also have this religion that has all these sort of really tough rules and a very low tolerance for mistakes or deviance from the set of rules? So there isn't a real sense of unconditional love many times in these marriages. It's very conditional love based on a mutual assent to the gospel as the binding force. So there's almost kind of Jesus between you and your spouse. And as long as everybody's obeying Jesus, the relationship's okay. But as soon as someone starts deviating from the path of Jesus, then the marriage is traumatized. And instead of being vulnerable and being open and candid and sharing and developing this emotional intimacy, so often, the offending party clams up and gets quiet and grows distant and starts leading this double life where they are trying to live the best they can in the relationship, but then they've got this other life, and emotional intimacy just diminishes even more. The couple grows apart, and you can go 10, 20, 30 years into a marriage and really have no deep emotional connection between you. And instead, you're just sort of injuring each other, alienating each other, kind of building your own siloed emotional life, self-medicating or seeking emotional intimacy in other means, and doing everything you can to avoid actual emotional intimacy with each other. And that's sort of a way that I maybe conceptualize.
No, and that's exactly what happened. Like, as I said, like, I don't need you. I didn't anymore, because what I needed from him was what he wasn't giving me, was that emotional intimacy. He thought he was providing the home and all the needs, which he was, but what I really wanted, all I wanted, was that emotional intimacy, and he wouldn't give it to me. He never had. I couldn't get to it. I thought it was not accessible, and he pulled further and further away and made these decisions that were hurting me and were going against, he was breaking promises he had made to me. I mean, and so I went the opposite way. And so Jesus was kind of in the middle, because for me, the only way I got my emotional needs met was through the church. And that emotional intimacy that I could not get with my husband, I found in God.
And you think, oh, well, that's wonderful. God's filling your emotional needs. But it's not necessarily good for the marriage, because God can't hold you at night. God can't hug you. God can't hold your hand. God can't make love to you unless you're married. There's one exception to that. But, and God's sort of this concept, but it's not who you're living with. It's not who you're sharing your bed with. It's not who you're raising your kids with.
But it was really confusing because at the same time, we didn't fight. We got along really well. Sexually, we've always been compatible. That has never been a big issue in our marriage. It's, for the most part, been good. And so all these boxes would be right. And I'm like, how are we missing this? Why can't we get to this? Why can't I get this from him? What am I doing wrong? And then got to the point where I was just so lonely and unhappy. And really at this point, I think there was a really big split that happened because he never came back to the church. We'd kind of had this, we healed it enough to continue, but it just led down these, like, we were just going in different directions. So, and Andrew, I want to thank you for being so vulnerable because you really are being vulnerable. But I want to make the statement that I don't believe that, like, you were some jerk. For me, it's like you were living in China and didn't know Chinese. And when have we ever had a lesson in priesthood or Relief Society about emotional intimacy? Like, the word intimacy has even been perverted in Mormonism to be synonymous with sex. And we don't want to talk about sex, so we're not going to talk about intimacy. But the truth is there's this whole world of emotional intimacy, which really is the fuel for relationships and marriages. And we've never had it's like the most important thing. It's like the fruit, the treasured fruit that's desirable above all other things. We all want our core emotional, intimate needs met. And we've literally never had a discussion about it, never had a family evening lesson about it, no priesthood or Relief Society lessons about it. When parents have the talk with us, if they have the talk at all, it's about the mechanics of sexuality. But there's never a talk about what is emotional intimacy, how do you get it, how do you nurture it, how do you lose it. People just don't know anything about it. And so that's a significant problem. And so with that, we just basically keep injuring each other, starving each other, and then each tries to find get their emotional needs met wherever they could. Andrew's doing it maybe with a friend or an associate or with work. Allison's getting it through God and church service and maybe raising her kids. And so you end up finding, getting your emotional, intimate needs met from every other source other than the one that is most important and most crucial in your life. And this is like, not only is this the most important thing, it's like rampantly an epidemic. Like, pretty much every couple goes through this and doesn't even know what's going on, like kind of that Chinese analogy. You just don't even know, you don't have the language or the conceptualization to even know what's going on, let alone how to fix it, right? And because you bring into your marriage these traumas of maybe sharing and being emotionally vulnerable and intimate and having someone betray your trust, maybe it's a mission president, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a friend, you're so injured that you are even disposed to not want to be emotionally intimate with the person that you're coupled with out of fear of them being someone who hurts and devastates you. So in some ways, we're almost incentivized to not want to be emotionally intimate with the person that we're desiring intimacy most from. And it's this really perilous, confusing, and almost tragic paradox. And so we kind of got off on this. No, but that's very accurate because that's where we were, and we were in such a hard place, and we were so divided and separate that when the faith crisis and Andrew leaving the church came forward and started to happen, it was just like the most devastating thing ever because we were already so distant. I was already distrusting him, lonely on my own. We were separate emotionally. He wasn't being honest. He wasn't sharing these things with me. And I'm so tied to church and God, and that's what's sustaining me. And then that's like the last straw that it's like, you've already withheld all this from me emotionally, and now you're going to take this. It just, anyway, it got really complicated and really painful fast. It wasn't like we were tight and all of a sudden he starts having a faith crisis. We were already like struggling when that came on the scene.
Yeah, and so Andrew, as you had this awakening and you're like, I want life to be real now. and you realize that religion just wasn't the thing you thought it was, as you start to unpeel that onion and you try and really say, I'm not happy, religion isn't working for me, I'm going to really scrutinize religion because I think it might be not what I need and not what's good and maybe not even true. For you, Allison, you've been so lonely and traumatized and distant and sad, you had grown to become attached to God and Jesus and the church as your source of emotional intimacy. So after injuring you with sort of his struggles as he was trying to find himself, now he starts injuring you in the one thing that had brought you peace and comfort.
Exactly. And the things that he had done to take care of himself or that had hurt me were against the principles of the church. So he was already doing things that I wasn't approving of. It was hurtful to me, but I could also blame some of these issues that he's having on not following the teachings of the church, right? So everything from the church's perspective is he's really messed up. He's the one at fault. Of course, he's not going to believe in the church because he's not doing things that would allow him to have the Spirit with him. And all these things, there were a lot of complicating factors that played into that as well.
Yeah, and so when you should be celebrated, Andrew, for finding yourself, for seeking truth, for growing and becoming whole, that's something to be celebrated in the human experience. The way you're perceived by the person that you're supposed to love and care for most is that you're becoming more and more evil. What's that like when you're trying to engage in introspection and growth, and it's conceptualized by your partner as further wickedness and evil?
Yeah.
It's exponential guilt is how I experienced it. I mean, I was already feeling inadequate. And it came to a point where I knew something inside of me just wasn't resolved, wasn't whole, wasn't complete. And at the time that I started to, for the first time, really think about that and try to understand it, that was inextricably linked to the pain that I had experienced in Mormonism. The judgment, the self-loathing, the guilt, the shame, the feeling that I was never enough, that I could never meet all of the criteria. In fact, no one can. And so when I started unpacking that, it was inextricably linked to Mormonism. And I got to the point where I kind of said, in order for me to understand me, I told you about the gritting of the teeth and not sleeping well, the anxiety, the stress that I'd never experienced in my life. When I got to the point where I wanted to figure that out, I came to this kind of conclusion that in order to understand me, I had to understand my connection to Mormonism. Was I broken or was Mormonism broken? Because this relationship, Mormonism and I, God and I, Jesus and I, it wasn't working out. And at least with Allison, I had many, many, many glimmers of beauty and connection and experience, time together. Whereas I didn't feel that with God. I felt like, okay, I had emotions over the years at different times, but was that God speaking to me? Or was that just a human having glimpses of true emotion and connection? So for me, I started to really unpack Mormonism and unpack Andrew at the same time. And that was a multi-year process, a lot of reading, a lot of listening, a lot of studying.
Give us kind of an overview of how you started unpacking Mormonism. Was it friendships? Was it relationships? Was it books? Was it podcasts? Kind of what was your timeline or sort of path to exploring Mormonism?
All of that you just mentioned, a lot of venting, a lot of blowing off steam. The one thing, when you asked me what were my vices, so to speak, that I turned to, my escapes, one huge one that I completely missed was adventure sports. So motorcycles, mountain bikes, snowboarding, skiing, wakeboarding, climbing, hiking, all these things that I would do that were intense and focused to help me kind of escape from the normal life. And so I would turn to that. And on my guys' trips, and through riding motorcycles through Mexico, I would love to just unload on the church. It felt great. And then in times when I'd be by myself, I would study a lot, read books, understand.
How did you first discover that there were things to learn about Mormonism that you hadn't been taught? And then how did that grow?
My mom had a big influence on that. She was, in addition to being a feminist, a Mormon feminist, she was also a scholar and grew up studying church history intensively. And I was aware of enough issues. I could have named enough issues to know that there was a bunch of stuff that I had never really gotten into. It wasn't like I was unaware of Joseph's, misdealings and his, really immoral lifestyle. I knew that was there. I just never wanted to know about it. I knew that there were problems with the Book of Mormon. I just didn't want to go there. I knew there were issues with race. I didn't want to go there. And I got to the point where that became inextricably linked with discovering myself and really rooting out what was causing me to have, this kind of negativity in my life. And so it was a deep dive and quest into Mormonism. And, I can share what that meant for me and how that happened, but ultimately I just came to the realization that I couldn't in any way look myself in the mirror and say, yeah, I can believe that. Even though part of that exploration involved going to the temple, reading scripture, praying, fasting. I did those things as part of my quest, and I did them sincerely because I did feel like, in a sense, I was at rock bottom, even though that probably wouldn't have made sense to somebody in the outside world. And ultimately, through a lot of study and contemplation, I remember a very distinct moment. I was driving in my car to go on a hike in California. I was by myself. And I uttered the words audibly, "The church isn't true." And that was the first time in my life where I felt like I had drawn a line, where I'd said, this is what I believe. For so long, I had kind of just not really thought about it, hadn't resolved it. And uttering those words was actually a pivotal moment in my development, because I gave myself the authority to make that decision, to make that determination based on a lot of work and a lot of contemplation. And I knew that I was being intellectually honest and emotionally honest with myself when I uttered those words. And that was at the same time liberating and incredibly horrifying, because I knew that I could not share that with Allison. And in fact, not only could I not share it with Allison, I felt like if I did, it would almost certainly lead to even further strife between us and probably divorce. So I feel like this whole setup, right, everything that's led up to this, was pitting my biggest weaknesses with her biggest fears. And we were in this downward spiral of suffocating each other, because I couldn't be there for her and she couldn't be there for me to help me discover, resolve, and unpack what had caused me the most pain in my life. And I couldn't do that for her either. And it was very scary, because I didn't know how we could ever get out of that. How can you lift each other when you're both drowning? When you're both clinging to each other, slowly sinking to the depths of the ocean? How can we all of a sudden, there's no life jacket to pull, there's no ripcord, and it just felt like a lot of despair, because it wasn't like our life was shit and it all needed to end, right? There was so many good things about it that I really wanted to make our relationship work. I wanted to be that husband, that father. I just didn't know how, and I could not understand a way for me to share my authentic self with her, and for her to share her authentic self with me, and that we could find harmony in that. It just seemed like an impossibility.
Really quick, a couple just micro questions. What were the top 5 or 10 sources of exploration that you turned to?
Mormon story, no. Friends, family, the few that I could talk to. Mormon Stories was huge, John, huge. You had only had a couple of hundred episodes by the time I started listening. And to hear other people vocalize and express the things that I had buried so deep within me and judged myself for so long was deeply cathartic and healing for me. I can't emphasize that enough. And I felt connected to other people after feeling disconnected from my people for so long. And that was deeply moving and deeply impactful. And that's why I said I love you at the beginning of this interview. I really do. I love your work. And reading books.
Any
books.
really fundamental book titles that...
Oh, all of the usuals, everything, No Man Knows My History, Rough Stone Rolling, Grant Palmer, all these books that...
Because some listeners won't know what these books are.
Okay. Yeah,
So an Insider's View of Mormon
Insider's
Origins.
View is a good overview, especially unpacking the Book of Mormon, because that was one of the last vestiges of Mormon that I clung to. Like, this is a physical object that represents consciousness, that represents thought, no one can deny this book exists. How the hell did it get here? And why did I give so many copies out in Chile? And that book helped me really understand. And even if you don't believe every single theory that he presents, there's enough substance there to create a very plausible kind of explanation for how it came into existence, right? And so those books and your podcast, and were very, very, very critical in that unpacking, and a lot of just thought, a lot of just sitting alone. I couldn't talk to Allison about it. I'd stay up at night listening to podcasts in our bed 6 inches away from her. It might as well have been your China example. We might as well have been on different planets, and we were only 6 inches apart.
He was listening to that, and I was reading my scriptures.
She was reading her scriptures.
Legitimately.
Like we are the poster children for that emotional intimacy void that you described in so many ways. And what makes it hard, actually, it's just hard to talk about. It's not fun. I just hope that someone out there can identify with it and develop the self-love and the self-care required to pull out of that. But we were that poster child couple. So many good fundamentals with this massive barrier between us.
And really quickly, we're going to come to you, Allison, but last question in this exchange with you. The 5 or 10 elements of the church that kind of disappeared or became untrue for you, what were the major discoveries or things you learned where you're like, yep, I don't believe in that anymore, I don't believe in that anymore, this is a problem, this is a problem? If you had to list them off, for those who maybe are just starting the journey, what were the ones for you?
I mentioned the numbers game earlier. The world is so huge. The numbers didn't make sense to me. It didn't add up. If that was the plan of salvation, it was a very poorly thought out plan, right? Number two...
To be less than 0.5% of the world's population is Mormons, and yet we're supposed to have God's full truth.
Only vessel for all of his truth, and so few people know about it. And even those who know about it, 2/3 of them don't participate. Doesn't make sense to me, never did. But the fallibility of prophets, starting with Joseph, right? Polyandry, polygamy, getting caught having sex with his housemaid, having sex with 14, 16-year-old girls, the Kirtland Savings disaster, the society, manipulating people, betraying their trust, pitting people against other people, bargaining for wives and daughters. This calculated, narcissistic approach that came through when you read books like Rough Stone Rolling, right? That narcissist jumped out of the pages to me. And I could see this person, who he really was, and there's no way I could believe he was God's one true prophet, second to Jesus Christ. But other things, doctrinal, flaws, this idea that a loving God would send his children to this horrible, confusing test on earth, and the rest of eternity would hinge on, your ability to perform And it just didn't ring true to me. It didn't make sense. The judgment, the critical castigation of his own children, and the sorrow and the misery that we experience as human, how could that come from God? It just didn't feel right. So there were some kind of bigger picture existential issues and a lot of issues with the church. Book of Mormon. The Book of Abraham, to me, was the first black and white part of my shelf.
Smoking gun sort of thing.
Smoking gun, right? The papyri, we found the papyri. They don't relate to Abraham in any way, shape, or form. And it turns out they're common funerary texts that any Egyptologist that has taken more than a 101 level class can identify. And we're led to believe that this came from Abraham. And none of the brethren, none of the leaders of the church, none of the prophets, seers, and revelators have any prophecy, seeing, or revelating to do with regard to the Book of Abraham, other than to say, I'm not a dodo. That doesn't work for me. I'm sorry, Elder Holland. We need a better explanation than that. That's the whole point of having a prophet. And if you can't give me a more insightful, thoughtful explanation than that, that to me was an open and shut case. It was open and shut. And then seeing just how disconnected Mormonism culture is from truth, from reality. The constant harm and damage we've done to women and to LGBT community and to other races, this superiority complex that we have, those hit me hard as I looked at the history, because I realized it wasn't a one person speaking as a man. It was systemic, going back from the very early days of the church through Brigham Young, through modern prophets. So those were kind of the top things that caused me to reach that conclusion that I ultimately reached.
Okay. Allison, so you are clinging to God stronger than ever. You've been betrayed in a way, and now he's attacking the one source of solace for you. Talk about what that's like to be a believing Orthodox spouse, really involved. I'm sure you had callings.
Yeah.
What is that like for you? What was it like? Take us into the depths of what that was like. Take as much time as you want.
Man, it was a deep, dark time. It was my worst nightmare, honestly. I know I've talked about depression a lot. I just want to clarify, for the most part of my life, I have not been depressed. When I go to the doctor, there's been situational depression. So when things would get very stressful, very intense, then it would kind of flare up, right? On my mission, early dating, probably some of the stressful time around 2005. There were little periods of time. I used some medication right before we got married for a short period of time, for 3 months. But when this hit, I spiraled into a deep depression. Physically, I was failing, emotionally, mentally. I did use medication for about a year during this time frame, but I was desperate. My mind was going 24 hours a day. I wasn't sleeping well. There was so much fear. It's like I could not turn. My mind was just on a permanent negative feedback loop. So much fear, so much anxiety. It was just this crazy game of mental gymnastics. I could not make anything add up. I think what was so difficult is I had so many experiences, personal experiences, spiritual experiences, that I could not let go of those things. I believe the church was true 100%. We would fight because he'd be like, you can't know it. And I'm like, I know it. I literally knew it. I believed it with everything. So for him to say these things, even when he'd show me the CES letter, he'd tell me all these facts, it's like they would just bounce right off. Because I'm like, okay, I guess you can make that not be true, but I can't change what I know and what I feel. I know this is true. There was just this depth to why I believed so deeply. And those two things just clashed. I heard what he said. I mean, I heard those things about the Book of Mormon and about Joseph Smith, but I could push them away. And it was just extremely isolating, lonely, devastating, and I didn't know how I was going to survive it. I mean, in some ways, like, I thought the easiest, like, the only solution that would be easy is, like, this sounds horrible to say, but there were times where I'm like, if he could just, like, die and not be here. Even if we divorced, he's here. Even if we divorce, he's still influencing my children. How do I do this? How do I survive? But yet I still really cared for him and loved him. I mean, it was just the most conflicting situation ever. I mean, on one hand, to say, like, if he didn't even have to exist, but then I still loved him. Like, the conflicts were deep and confusing and so unsettling that I could make no sense of it.
And he was being a good provider, and he was, at this point being faithful, and
he was.
had pretty much been faithful his whole life.
And what was so
a good dad, right?
and confusing to me is that he didn't want to walk away from the marriage, and that he's like, I don't want to do this because I'm too afraid of losing you, and he's trying to fight for our marriage. And that was even confusing to me, because I'm like, you've pulled away from me for all these years, and now all of a sudden you're like wanting to save the marriage, and you're giving me more attention and time than I've ever had before. Like, I had a hard time understanding, like, his commitment and why he wasn't running away. I mean, it was all just, it was just mind-blowing. It was so, so confusing.
So in what ways, let's just say that there are people going through a faith crisis right now in a mixed faith marriage, and they're trying to cope with that and deal with it. In what ways did he mishandle how he was going through it? What were the ways where he maybe did more harm than good? The
anger.
Give us some examples of what he would do.
Every time he would talk about the church or anything related to it, it was with so much, like, vitriol, so much, like, just, there was so many, like, offhanded, like, sarcastic comments. And it was never like we could sit down. I felt like I'd be put on the spot. Like, well, explain to me why, how do you think you know this? Everything would become a debate. Everything was heated. Everything was, like, so energetic and charged that he wasn't speaking to me through the way I function. I didn't want to be challenged. I wanted to connect. I would have happily spoken to him about expressing my feelings and listening to his if there wasn't all the heat and anger and force behind it. It was like he was going to convince me. He was going to, shove everything down my throat. And that did not work.
Yeah. What happens when someone's coming at you with trying to get you to not believe? What does that make you do?
It pushes you further into your belief. It has, like, backfire effect, 100%.
So did you find yourself actually clinging more to your beliefs in the church?
Absolutely.
So what's that like for you, Andrew? The more you're outraged, the more you're frustrated, the more you're trying to actually share and be authentic and intimate, the more retrenched she gets in her beliefs.
Yeah, and that was my side of the equation. I felt like I was being restrained. I really did, man. I was like, the rage was deep and real, and I didn't even know how to handle the anger, like it should be a force, a motivator to prompt change. And if I wish I could have redone all that. I wish I could have stepped back and replayed those episodes. But, to my defense somewhat, there was zero compassion. I'm sorry. It just wasn't there regarding the church. She cared a lot about me. I knew that. But regarding the church, there was a carve-out. And there was zero compassion. In fact, John, I would say the reverse of compassion. There was blame and judgment.
And contempt, probably.
Contempt. I can't tell you how many times I heard the words, well, if you would just follow, when you would just do a better job, if you could just read more, pray more, give it your all, then you wouldn't have these issues. The very thing that was causing me so much pain in her mind was the answer to my problem. Yeah. It was this cyclical loop where we couldn't spin out of it. And so it was, I knew that she didn't react well to the anger. I knew that she didn't want to have a trial, put the church on trial, or Joseph, or the Book of Mormon, or anything. But it was incredibly difficult and self-defeating for me to even say, you know, I don't feel good at church, or I don't feel anything when I read the scriptures. Or even beyond that, did you know that the book of Abraham papyri, the original text for that book, have nothing to do with Abraham? There was no compassion. There was no, well, tell me more. How did you learn that? Is it true? Why did you reach that conclusion? Help me understand. The analogy that I would use over and over, it's probably triggering for me to even bring it up now, years later, was if I had cancer, you would be doing all kinds of research. You'd be reading every book. You'd be talking to every professional, oncologist, doctor, every medical clinic in the U.S. We'd be figuring out the best treatment plan if I had cancer, and you'd be my advocate. And because my cancer is a lack of belief in the system that you hold so dear, you're not only not helping me, but you're telling me the cancer is my fault. And it was just a very hard dysfunction at that time, you know, to have that lack of communication. And we both contributed to it, especially me.
And if you had to describe why you were angry, what were the pillars of your anger? So far you've said not being cared about or really listened to. What were you scared of? Anger is a secondary emotion. Usually under anger is something like fear.
Yeah.
What were you afraid of?
Everything. I felt an enormous sense of betrayal. This institution that I had pledged and sacrificed so much for had withheld the most important parts of its history, the most critical parts of its history, had lied to me about morality, had judged me, had tribally shamed me on a massive scale on at least 2 occasions, had told me for 3 decades that I wasn't good enough, had at the same time held the truth of its history and of its founding beliefs and doctrines and documents from my view. And so the betrayal was the biggest thing. And then second from that was a mistrust, the idea that I gave everything to this plan and this plan isn't working out, right? Like I bought into this and I'm here, I've laid the groundwork my whole life for this, and this is what I get. You know, and then thirdly, it was a lost opportunity, right? Looking back at my life, my teenage years, my mission years, college years, you know, I went from a child to an adult overnight. I never had that kind of freedom of that transition that all humans should go through, right? I jumped from a mission into a parent, like in a matter of 2 years. And there was this huge sense of loss of opportunity there, that I'm a free, adventurous person. Like I should have been doing other things, right? And on and on and on. But those were the emotions that were really kind of causing me a lot of pain and a lot of suffering at the time.
What about fear around your marriage and your children and your family as it related to the church?
Yeah, no, that was huge. Huge, John. On one hand, if I was 100% authentic, I thought for sure that it would destroy my marriage and ultimately harm my children's my relationship with my children, and may lead to, you know, being rejected in my community. And on the other hand, I couldn't keep it inside. So it was palpable. It was tough, and I did have a ton of fear about what that path would how that would unfold and where it would lead. And I became resigned to the fact that my marriage at best was a 50-50, coin flip as to whether or not it survives.
But let's just say you contemplated staying silent and just trying to put your head down and be the good priesthood leader, and then having, 10 or 20 or 30 more years where your kids were raised in the church and you were just kind of being the good soldier. What were you scared about from that scenario?
I couldn't physically do it. At the time that I started really unpacking Mormonism, I was unpacking Andrew. Those were inextricably linked for me. And at the time that we actually started having a dialogue, I already knew that plan that you just described was not possible for me. I couldn't be a healthy, full, complete, happy person and live for 20 or 30 more years faking it. It was not in me. And so I didn't use those words when I described it to Allison, but I think you probably got that impression too.
Oh, no, I knew that. It was very clear. When it finally came out, that wasn't an option. I knew that wasn't an option.
Couldn't do it.
Okay, so you being the good soldier wasn't an option.
He'd been the good soldier for the previous, 15 to 17 years.
Yeah.
So by the time this stuff is really becoming active in our marriage, he's already at that point.
That wasn't
There was
an
no
option.
more pretending to be the good priesthood leader. That had died a long time ago.
Okay, so you knew that wasn't an option, but what about the option of you doing your thing and your wife and kids remaining super devout? What were you scared of in that scenario? Because some would say, oh, what's so bad? Your family's super moral and honest and faithful, and families are important and religious, but who cares because they're living a good life. Yeah. What were you scared about if Allison and your kids were to follow down that road?
Well, that is the scenario that we created. That's the conclusion we both came to ultimately, was that I would leave the church and she would stay in and I would support her and the kids. And that wasn't the worst case scenario in my mind. That was not ideal, but at least it kept keeping my family. It's not what I wanted, but it was enough. And we tried that for a few years, and it didn't get better. Our communication improved, right? The technical parts of our relationship improved. We identified things like the lack of intimacy, and we really started to make progress on a lot of the tools and techniques, and started talking more and spending time together. But we were setting aside this whole issue of how to raise children in a mixed faith marriage. We never, ever could decide on that. Like, we would have these discussions. We'd go out to dinner and we'd say, okay, let's talk about mission. Well, I want my kids to know all of the ugly truths, the good, the bad, and the ugly, before they decide to go on a mission. And Allison would be like, well, what does that mean? And how are we going to do that? And why you're only going to focus on the negative? I mean, when you really get down to the details and the logistics, it's hard. It's hard to raise kids in such disparate ideologies. And it was, those were some very challenging conversations. But in hindsight, it was preparation for what was to come. But at the time, there was still an enormous amount of fear on both of our sides.
But I think it was the topic of the children that really became the breaking point.
So I'll ask you, Andrew, and then you, Allison. So devil's advocate, I met someone who once said, I'm a dad, I know the church isn't true, but it's a good way to live, and so I'm just going to fake it and let my kids. And I'm like, well, don't you feel an obligation to tell your kids the truth and to not have them be deceived and to have them know everything that they're following? He's like, it's a good way to live. I'm just not going to bring it up. So what were your fears in having that information about the truthfulness of the church being withheld from them? Why wasn't it just, they'll go to BYU and they'll get married in the temple and they'll live happy Mormon lives? What were you scared about that made you want them to have that information?
I have heard that argument, and I respect it. I really do. I have personal friends who view it just that way. But for me, it didn't work. I'm not the kind of person who knows.
But why did you want them to know? Why did you need them to know?
because I didn't want them to look back 20 years in the future and go, why didn't you tell me? At a minimum, you were inauthentic and withheld yourself from me. At a maximum, you knew the truth. You knew history. You knew the facts, and you withheld them to let me blindly walk down a path with such huge amount of magnitude and importance without telling me the truth. So that weighed on me heavily. I felt the only way we could navigate the mixed faith relationship was with raw truth and authenticity. And that was something that we were both still working on.
In some sense, you would have been doing to your kids what the church did to you.
Absolutely. I felt that way. And I couldn't deal with that. I couldn't deal with. In other words, if Allison would have said, we'll stay married, but you have to pretend the church is true and let the kids devote their lives to it, that would have been a non-starter. Couldn't have worked for me. You know, I was okay with them staying in the church, and I still am today, but they need to do it with both eyes open. Every decision in life, not just about the church, every decision in life, and the more important the decision, the more important this concept is, must make with a clear vision and truth, without strings attached, without condition, without prejudice, without biases. We need to understand the truth and the reality before we make big commitments, and that was immensely important for me as a parent.
Now, Allison, looking back now, seeing it with different eyes, what do you regret about how you treated Andrew and how you were there for them when he was really going through not just a hard time, but you could almost say in some ways it's a heroic journey to
Absolutely.
face something where there's so much potential negative consequence, but to care about truth and sort of a firm foundation so much that you're willing to face jeopardizing your marriage, alienating yourself from friends and family, mental health, whatever the problems are. In some ways, maybe you could say he was going on a hero's journey. Whether or not you agree with, whether the church is true or not.
He absolutely was.
So,
Now viewing that, I am, I do have a level of guilt of not being able to, that I was incapable of supporting him and being there for him, and that he went through that painful, painful journey alone. But I have this really deep, deep respect for him, that he was so driven and had to be true to himself and had to do it, and he was going to do it at all costs, that he wasn't that he wouldn't just sit back and suffer and let it go and not deal with it. He couldn't. It's not him. He's so driven. He was so willing to do the fight and do whatever it took. And I just have I'll always have a deep respect for that, because that was so incredibly difficult. I mean, just my own faith transition was so incredibly difficult and painful. And I had his full support during the whole time. And I couldn't imagine if I was trying to grapple with that and sort that out while the person I love the most is against me. And I don't know how he did it, but I'm so, so grateful that he stayed true to his inner voice and that he listened to it and followed it and had that strength of character to do it. I have a deep respect for it, and I have a deep amount of, remorse and sympathy that I was incapable of being there for him to support him through it, because I know what a deep, dark space that is, and I can't even imagine what it was for him doing it alone.
And so if, let's just say a believing spouse is listening now, and they're in the middle of the same battle, retrenching, fighting, distancing from each other, and then the kids are kind of footballs in the battle, what advice would you give that believing spouse, even if their beliefs remain very precious to them, put yourself in that sort of Orthodox believing mindset and make a plea to believing spouses?
You know what, I think what really helped us a lot was, and everyone's situation is so different, right? But I think we had to go back and work on our marriage first. There were things we had to fix between us, and taking the church out of it and fixing some of those problems first. But I guess what I ultimately say to anybody is you just have to be true to yourself. I think you have to love and respect the other person and recognize that
But you were being true to yourself.
I was.
But you realized you were hurting him, and maybe you weren't acting as you wish you had.
You know, I have regrets that I could not see what he was going through. I could not understand it, right? I regret that. Like, I wish I could have, but in the moment I couldn't. But from that believing place, I guess what I always went back to is when I was believing and I would pray and I would work and I would struggle through it, I always got the answer to stick with it and everything would be okay. Every time. I could never get the answer to walk away, to leave, to divorce. My bottom line answer was always, I have no idea how in the world this will ever work out, but stick with it. And so that's what I did, even though sometimes I wanted to run. So I guess it comes back to, I think you have to be true to yourself and listen to your heart and what answers you're getting from yourself as to what you're supposed to do. I think every situation is different. And I just had to fight through it and keep going and not give up. And things do work out and things change and things fall into your path that make it work out.
So it sounds like what you're saying is don't give up.
Don't give up.
You're kind of saying something really interesting, which is you're acknowledging you wish you had acted differently, but at the time, it's like that Chinese example. You can't like make yourself understand Chinese. You don't understand it. So
no, I literally couldn't understand.
You
like
can't see
I
his
did the
worldview.
best that I could for where I was at. So do I have regrets? Yes and no, right? Like I did the best I could. I was incapable of seeing his point of view. I couldn't see it. And so I did the best I could with the knowledge that I had. I wish I could have seen it. I wish I could have been there for him. But we were both incapable of kind of doing it for each other. It was like this learning process and path we had to go down and figure out to get where we are now. It was just part of our path. Like we had to fight our way through it. So yeah, I say, don't give up. But I also say, listen to your voice and be as loving and compassionate as you can, but don't lose yourself in the process. I could have just bowed down to him, right? He's always like coming in so strong. I had to fight for my voice. I had to fight every day to like keep my feet on the ground and not get mowed over in the process.
So like, sounds like what you're saying is live your process, but don't give up on the marriage.
Yeah.
Do everything you can.
Absolutely.
Leave everything on the field.
We did everything we could. We went to numerous therapists. We did, actually, I mean, like we worked. We did everything we could to make it work. We did it. We were willing to try. We both gave 100%, 110% effort to get past this and to make our marriage work. We did not ever give up. So that's what I would say. Just do not give up. You just keep fighting until, I don't know, you just keep fighting and things show up. Things happen, things shift, things change. I mean, things change. I changed 100%. I mean, it's bizarre what actually transpired and I am where I am. I mean, that is It's
a miracle.
almost, it's
kind
almost,
of a miracle.
it is. It's kind of inexplicable. You just keep going.
So listeners, our memory card is about to run out. So we are going to thank you for joining us up to this point on this really wonderful interview with Andrew and Allison Jolley. We hope you've enjoyed their epic journey. We're getting so many positive comments on Facebook about how people are loving this interview, how they're connecting with it, how they don't want to let it go. All we're going to do is thank you for joining us so far. We're gonna stop this live broadcast, stop this interview, call this kind of segment 2. We're going to unload the memory card, and then we're going to start right back up with 2 parts. Number 1, how they got out of this mess, how they healed their marriage and got stronger. To now, I experience them as a couple that deeply loves each other and are very much on the same page. We're going to figure out how they did that, and then we're going to talk about how they got into the cannabis business or the marijuana business, and why they believe in that and what that means to them, and why they think Utah should legalize medical marijuana. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting Mormon Stories. And please don't go away. Please join us in just a few minutes for the final parts of this epic interview. Take care, everybody. Talk to you soon.